There are palaces whose marble walls have absorbed more screams than songs. Hidden in one such empire lay a chamber no historian dared to name, a sanctuary built not for prayer, but for pleasure shaped into punishment. Behind its silk curtains, devotion was measured in obedience, and beauty became a sentence. Tonight, we uncover the house of silk and silence, the forbidden cradle of a cult that turned desire into doctrine, and worship into ruin. In the oldest quarter of the imperial palace, beyond the public halls where ministers bowed and poets recited, a narrow corridor curved toward a door that no record described. Servants called it the Silent Gate. Behind it began a world the court pretended not to know, a maze of perfumed chambers draped in translucent silk. The air always smelled of amber and burnt myrrh, disguising another scent that never faded, the sharp trace of fear. The House of Silk had been commissioned under the pretext of honoring the arts of love and beauty. It was to be a place where music, fragrance, and form could merge in divine harmony. Craftsmen labored for years, their hands guided by scholars who studied the geometry of desire. Every arch curved like a pulse. Every lattice filtered light, as if to caress rather than illuminate. When it was finished, the emperor himself declared it the empire's heart of refinement. Yet within a season, refinement turned to ritual. At first, only chosen performers were allowed inside, singers, dancers, and poets of unrivaled grace. Their duties were simple: to entertain the emperor in private gatherings. But rumors soon escaped the silken walls. Attendants whispered that the performers never returned unchanged. Some emerged days later, pale and trembling, their voices broken as though they had sung too long. Others vanished entirely, their names erased from payrolls and memory alike. The officials dismissed the gossip as envy. Still, each night a faint rhythm echoed through the corridor, slow, deliberate, and never quite musical. It was said that the sound came from instruments fashioned from human breath, the moans of those whose pleasure had turned to prayer. None dared investigate. In a palace where suspicion itself could mean death, ignorance was a shield. A kitchen girl once glimpsed the interior when she delivered wine. She later told a confessor that the walls glowed crimson under 100 lamps, and that women knelt in silence while a figure in golden robes traced their shoulders with a blade of glass. Her account spread briefly before she drowned in a cistern 2 nights later. The record lists it as accident. What truly occurred within those rooms remained known only to a select circle. They called themselves the devoted. To them, the emperor was more than ruler. He was a vessel of divine desire, chosen to reveal the hidden balance between pleasure and pain. Their creed insisted that beauty must suffer to be eternal, that obedience perfected the body, and silence preserved the soul. Each belief found expression in acts that blurred worship and violation until they were indistinguishable. Servants noticed new customs at court. Invitations sealed with red wax arrived for certain nobles, always delivered at dusk. Those summoned never discussed what transpired afterward, but their eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen both splendor and horror within the same breath. A poet later wrote, "Where silk whispers, truth is flayed." His verses were banned. By the end of that year, the House of Silk had become more than architecture. It was a heartbeat pulsing beneath the empire's grandeur. Its existence was both secret and inevitable, a reflection of power's oldest hunger. No one yet called it a cult, and no one dared call it evil. But history would remember that everything which followed, the rituals, the madness, the blood, was born in those rooms where music hid the cries of the faithful. He had once been called the Philosopher King, a ruler whose wisdom seemed boundless, whose reign promised enlightenment after generations of war. In his youth, he had studied the languages of distant scholars and the teachings of mystics who claimed that pleasure was the path to understanding the divine. They wrote that the body was a mirror of the soul, and that pain, when embraced, could cleanse both. These were ideas meant for contemplation, not command, But the emperor was not a man who stopped at theory. He began to read by candlelight long after his council had retired. His favorite texts were those that spoke of discipline and transcendence through sensation. Courtiers would find his chambers littered with notes in his own hand, sketches of human figures annotated with strange symbols, diagrams of nerve and vein drawn beside verses from sacred hymns. He spoke to no one of their meaning, yet his interest turned gradually from the mind to the flesh. The transformation was subtle at first. He summoned physicians to discuss the limits of pain and the endurance of desire. He questioned poets about the moment where longing becomes suffering. To each answer, he responded with silence, as if listening to something none of them could hear. Those closest to him began to notice a coldness beneath his serenity, a gaze that weighed people not by merit or loyalty, but by the purity of their fear. When a scholar once warned that his experiments blurred sacrilege and science, the emperor smiled and said, "If the gods fear my curiosity, then they are lesser than man." The scholar vanished within a fortnight. His estate was seized, his family confined, and his name removed from the archives. The emperor claimed he had departed voluntarily to the desert for prayer. None believed it. The House of Silk soon became his sanctuary. He withdrew there for days, emerging with eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, his hands scented with the oils used in the rituals. Musicians were ordered to compose slower hymns, tones designed to provoke longing rather than joy. He demanded that dancers perform in silence, their movements punctuated only by the hiss of their own breath. What began as entertainment turned into an inquiry. How much submission could be drawn from beauty before it ceased to be beautiful? In his private reflections, preserved later by the court chronicler, he wrote that the body is a vessel too fragile to hold divinity, yet too sacred to waste on mortality. He sought to prove this belief through living demonstration. Servants became subjects, courtiers witnesses. What he called enlightenment was, in truth, dissection, not of flesh, but of humanity itself. Ministers pleaded for his attention to matters of state, taxation, defense, the unrest among peasants, but he dismissed them with gestures of absent patience. "The empire will endure," he murmured, "when it understands the will behind desire." None dared question him again. Behind his calm exterior grew something darker than lust, a need to command not merely bodies, but souls. In the following months, strange decrees were issued. Theatrical performances once public were now restricted to the palace. The finest courtesans were summoned to the House of Silk, their families rewarded in gold to ensure silence. The imperial archives record a decline in executions during that time, not because the emperor had grown merciful, but because punishment had taken a new, private form. Those who served him began to understand that the emperor no longer sought power through conquest or governance. His empire had become the human body, his wars fought in whispers and skin. And though his court still addressed him as ruler of nations, in truth he ruled something greater and more terrifying, the intimate boundaries of devotion itself. The chronicles mark it as the Feast of Renewal, a night meant to honor the empire's founding. Yet in truth, it was the first gathering of the emperor's chosen circle, the moment when curiosity crossed into doctrine. Invitations were delivered only to the most loyal courtiers, generals, scholars, and consorts who owed their fortunes to the emperor's favor. Each was commanded to arrive after dusk, unaccompanied and silent. The location was not the grand hall of state, but the forbidden wing, the House of Silk. They entered a chamber draped entirely in red. The air was thick with incense that dulled the senses and slowed the pulse. At the center stood the emperor, cloaked not in gold, but in simple white, his expression solemn, almost priestly. No guards were present. Only attendants masked in pale veils moved soundlessly, carrying trays of wine tinted darker than blood. It was said the emperor himself mixed the drink, though none knew what it contained. When the last guest arrived, the doors were sealed. The emperor spoke softly, his voice measured and resonant. "Tonight," he said, "we reclaim the unity that fear and shame have divided. Power is not born from dominion, but from surrender." His words carried the rhythm of prayer, though no god's name was uttered. The courtiers listened, uncertain whether to kneel or applaud. Then a woman was led into the room. She was young, noble, known for her beauty and for her defiance. The emperor introduced her as the Pure One, chosen to embody the empire's devotion. Her eyes met his without trembling. "To serve," he declared, "one must first be unmade." The attendants removed her ornaments, her silks, her dignity. She did not resist, though her breath grew uneven. What followed was neither execution nor ceremony, as the court had known. It was performance, slow, deliberate, and excruciating in its elegance. The emperor guided the act as though conducting music. Every movement was choreographed to reveal the body's fragility under power's gaze. The courtiers watched in silence, their discomfort trapped behind masks of obedience. Some turned away, yet none left. To leave would mean disloyalty, and disloyalty was death. When it ended, the chamber was utterly still. The woman collapsed at the emperor's feet, her eyes half open, her body trembling not from fear but exhaustion. The emperor touched her head gently and whispered words no one heard. Then, as attendants carried her away, he addressed the gathering once more. "You have seen the veil lifted. In surrender, there is truth. In silence, divinity." He dismissed them before dawn. Each guest left as if emerging from a nightmare they dared not name. None spoke of what had occurred, yet something unspoken bound them afterward, a collective guilt that resembled faith. From that night, those who had attended became known as the initiated. They were granted special privileges, though none desired them. To be close to the emperor was now to share his secret. The next day, the woman's name was erased from the registry of nobles. Officially, she had departed to a monastery for reflection. Unofficially, servants whispered that she still lived within the house of silk, her voice gone, her beauty veiled. Some claimed she wandered its corridors at night, touching the silk walls as though searching for herself. Historians later debated whether she had volunteered or been chosen. But the chronicler who recorded the event wrote a single, haunting line beneath the date. "Thus began the worship of pain disguised as devotion, and thus ended the innocence of power. She arrived from the eastern provinces beneath a shroud of rain, a woman of quiet grace. Neither noble nor servant, her origins lost to rumor. She was called Alara, though within weeks, no one dared speak her name aloud. The emperor met her first in his library, where scrolls of forbidden philosophy gathered dust. Her eyes wandered not to the gold or the guards, but to the symbols written in the margins, his own notes about the union of pleasure and suffering. She understood them without translation. In her presence, the emperor's voice softened. His questions, once scattered, began to form a creed. "Is pain not the truest language of loyalty?" he asked. She answered only, "Pain is truth without deceit." Those words became scripture before the moon completed its cycle. Within a month, Alara was no longer a guest. She moved into the House of Silk, where the walls still remembered the first ritual silence. The emperor ordered that no one enter her chambers without invitation. Yet from behind the veiled curtains came the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic, like the pulse of something alive. When she emerged, her beauty had become something terrible. Her garments were white, her wrists marked with thin lines of crimson. She called the courtiers together and spoke as though delivering a sermon. "Pleasure is corruption when it seeks comfort," she said. "Only through agony can the soul be cleansed of its lies." The emperor watched her speak and saw in her conviction what he had always searched for: divinity through cruelty. Under her guidance, the rituals changed. Gone were the shallow indulgences of the emperor's early obsessions. What replaced them was structure, devotion, and doctrine. Every act was measured, every cry catalogued, every drop of blood given meaning. The House of Silk ceased to be a palace wing. It became a temple. Alara's followers called her the Priestess of Pain. They claimed she could touch a person's skin and feel their sins, that she could draw sorrow from the body like poison from a wound. She spoke of a faith that demanded no gods, only the endurance of the believer. The weak called her monstrous. The strong called her holy. Yet all knelt before her eventually. Even generals who once ruled armies came to her chamber seeking absolution. They entered with pride and left trembling, marked by her crimson threads, symbols of devotion sewn into flesh. The emperor watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable. Whether he envied her power or adored it, no one could tell. As her influence grew, so did the house's silence. Servants who spoke of what they saw disappeared by morning. Courtiers began to fear the sound of bells, for bells meant another ritual was beginning. The palace, once filled with laughter and music, became an echoing labyrinth of whispers. Yet the priestess seemed untouched by the darkness she spread. Her rituals were precise, her tone almost compassionate as she inflicted torment. She told her followers, "What breaks the body frees the soul." And they believed her. The emperor declared her the keeper of his new faith. He abandoned councils and scholars, spending his nights beside her altar, seeking revelation through pain. Together, they turned devotion into spectacle, and spectacle into rule. By the year's end, silk veils replaced royal banners, and the scent of incense masked the stench of blood. No one dared question her power. Those who once ruled now knelt. Those who once prayed now screamed. And in the heart of the empire, where pleasure had once been luxury, it became worship, and worship became terror. The Feast of Nightfall began as a celebration of the emperor's reign, an evening when the empire's most powerful gathered to drink, to flatter, and to forget their fears. Yet this year, the House of Silk opened its doors for the event, and nothing that entered those doors would ever remain the same. The invitations were sealed in black wax and delivered by veiled attendants who spoke no words. Each scroll contained only a single instruction: arrive masked and leave reborn. The guests obeyed. They arrived draped in silks of shadow, their faces hidden behind ivory masks carved with two expressions: bliss on one side, agony on the other. The chamber was transformed. Candles lined the floors, their flames dancing against mirrors that distorted every reflection. Music drifted through the air, not the delicate melodies of court musicians, but a slow, haunting rhythm played on instruments that sounded like sighs. The emperor sat at the head of the room, robed in gold so pale it appeared white beneath the flickering light. Beside him stood the Priestess of Pain, her mask unadorned, her face untouched by fear. When the final guest arrived, she raised her hand and the music ceased. Her voice carried softly, yet it silenced the chamber. "Tonight," she said, "you shall be freed of the burden of self. Behind your masks you are neither noble nor slave. You are vessels of desire, of guilt, of truth." The ritual began without warning. Attendants moved among the guests, guiding them toward one another. The masks stripped away recognition. Husbands reached for strangers, generals knelt before courtesans, priests trembled beside soldiers. What began as indulgence dissolved into surrender. The air thickened with incense and sweat, with the scent of roses masking something metallic beneath. The emperor watched, unmoving. The priestess moved among the crowd like a shadow, her fingers tracing the edges of the ivory faces. Wherever she touched, stillness followed, and then release. Her whispers wove through the chamber, words like prayers and curses intertwined. As the night deepened, the music grew dissonant. Laughter turned to sobs. Pleasure to cries that echoed like confessions. Blood appeared first on the floor, then on the walls, though no one remembered how. The masks, once pure ivory, were now streaked crimson. Still, none removed them. By dawn, The candles had nearly burned to stubs. The emperor rose, signaling the end. The attendants opened the doors, and the gray light of morning poured into the chamber. 2 bodies lay upon the floor, one of a courtier whose mask had cracked in half, his throat bound by a silk cord. The other of a woman still smiling beneath her mask, eyes open, staring at nothing. The priestess knelt beside them, touching each forehead with a mark of red dye. "Holy offerings," she murmured. The emperor repeated her words aloud, his tone serene. "Holy offerings," he said again, louder, until the phrase filled the silent room like a chant. The surviving guests removed their masks slowly. None dared look at one another. Beneath the brightening sky, they filed out in silence, pale, trembling, their fine garments ruined. Some wept quietly. Others laughed softly, as though they had glimpsed something divine. From that night onward, no one entered a ritual unwillingly. Yet none who entered ever left unchanged. The masks were kept, locked in a chamber beneath the House of Silk, and when the next feast of nightfall came, every courtier who had attended returned, not by command, but by desire. They said the masks whispered to them in their dreams. He was known simply as the chronicler, the man whose ink preserved the empire's triumphs and concealed its wounds. For 20 years, he had recorded every decree, every conquest, every word the emperor wished to outlast his breath. But when the House of Silk became the heart of the court, his quill began to tremble. He was ordered to chronicle only glory. What he saw instead was something no ink should capture. The chronicler's chamber stood near the library, a quiet place of scrolls and fading light. Through a narrow slit in the wall, he sometimes glimpsed the forbidden corridors where the priestess passed, her white robes brushing against marble floors streaked with candle wax. At night, the air carried sounds that had no name, whispers, that rose and fell like chanting, laughter that curdled into silence. Curiosity, once his ally, became his undoing. One night, while delivering a record of taxation, he found a passage left unguarded. The scent of burning resin and spiced wine drifted through the corridor. Following it, he reached a narrow opening concealed behind hanging drapes. Beyond lay the inner chamber of the House of Silk. He stood in darkness, heart pounding, as his eyes adjusted to the glow of hundreds of oil lamps. Inside, nobles and scholars knelt in concentric circles. The emperor sat at the center, bare-chested, his eyes closed as if in prayer. Before him stood the priestess, her hand raised over a trembling young man, a servant chosen for devotion. The ritual unfolded with terrible precision. Every gesture, every breath, was choreographed into a dance between agony and transcendence. The chronicler's stomach turned, yet his gaze could not look away. He watched as the priestess spoke of truth through torment, of purity born from pain. She pressed a blade to the servant's palm, drawing blood not as punishment, but as revelation. The assembly murmured her words like scripture. The chronicler's mind rebelled. He wanted to scream, to flee, but his historian's instinct betrayed him. He began to write, his quill moving faster than his fear. Night after night, he returned. Always unseen, always recording. What he produced was no longer history, it was confession. He described the rituals in meticulous detail, the offerings, the chants, the emperor's gaze that never faltered. His pages grew darker, stained with both ink and sweat. He no longer wrote for the emperor, nor for the empire. He wrote for truth, or perhaps for absolution. One morning, the priestess summoned him. He entered her chamber trembling, scrolls hidden beneath his robe. She looked at him as though she had always known. "You have seen," she said softly, "and you have written." He fell to his knees, begging for mercy. But her tone remained serene. "Mercy is for the ignorant. You are not ignorant." She did not destroy his writings. Instead, she ordered him to continue. To document not for condemnation, but for worship. "Your words will immortalize our faith," she told him. "You will be our scripture." From that day, his ink became their altar. Each line he wrote found him closer to the cult's blasphemous vision. He began to believe that his pen carried power, that through description, he too partook in revelation. The chronicler's eyes dulled, his voice vanished. When servants passed his chamber, they saw only a man hunched over parchment, whispering to himself words no longer his own. And in the deepest hours of night, he sometimes dipped his quill not in ink, but in his own blood. The famine began quietly. It crept through the outer provinces like a disease of silence. First the farmers vanished, then the harvests, then the voices of the hungry. In the capital, the markets emptied and whispers replaced trade. Yet within the palace walls, the emperor declared that divine favor could not fade. To prove it, he announced a feast, a grand banquet to honor the gods of prosperity and the endurance of the realm. The announcement spread like fire through dry grass. Starving commoners pressed against the gates, begging for grain, while the emperor's courtiers prepared tables of silver and gold. The House of Silk, long associated with secrecy, became the stage for spectacle. Its halls, once perfumed with incense, now carried the scent of roasted meats, rare delicacies hauled from distant provinces where people starved in the fields. The priestess of pain oversaw every detail. She decreed that the feast would not merely celebrate survival, it would redeem suffering. The body hungers not only for food, she whispered to the emperor, but for meaning. Her words settled in his mind like scripture. Together, they transformed the banquet into ritual. When night fell, torches illuminated the courtyard like false stars. The nobility gathered in jeweled garments, their laughter brittle and forced. The emperor sat upon an obsidian throne, a crown of withered vines upon his head, a mockery of harvest. The first course arrived, gilded platters of exotic fruit, drenched in honey. Then came the dancers, their bodies glistening with oil, moving in perfect rhythm to drums that mimicked a heartbeat. As the final dance ended, the priestess rose and clapped her hands. Servants entered, trembling, carrying covered trays. "Behold," she declared, "the offering of devotion." When the lids were lifted, silence fell. The trays bore not food, but the severed heads of those accused of hoarding grain, rebels, thieves, and beggars dragged from the city prisons. Gasps rippled through the hall, but the emperor's face did not change. He raised a goblet and proclaimed, "Their hunger has been quenched in service to the divine." None dared to leave. Some began to laugh, others to weep. The music returned, louder, fevered. The feast continued as if nothing had changed. Then, the performers, those same dancers who had earlier delighted the court, were brought back, stripped of their ornaments. They were told their final dance would secure the empire's fortune. What followed blurred the line between devotion and slaughter. The nobles watched, too afraid to turn away, too enthralled to stop. Each act of cruelty was masked as ceremony. Each death was praised as sacrifice. Those who protested were dragged before the emperor, accused of impiety. The priestess's voice was calm as she commanded the guards to feed them to the hunger they despise. Their screams became part of the music. By midnight, the feast had become a frenzy, a theater of desperation and delirium. Plates shattered, goblets overflowed with wine dark as blood, and the emperor laughed until tears streaked his cheeks. He had proven his dominion over famine, but at a cost no god would bless. When dawn finally came, the table stood empty. The torches had burned low, revealing the stains beneath the silk. The priestess knelt before the emperor, her voice low, her eyes shining. "They have eaten," she said, "and they will remember." That morning, the starving masses outside the palace gates found the refuse of the feast thrown into the streets. Bones, scraps, and ashes. Some knelt and ate in silence. Others turned away, whispering that the empire had feasted on its own soul. From that night forward, the people called it not a banquet, but the feast of flesh. The empress had long learned the art of silence. In the early years of her reign, she had been admired for her composure, a woman of grace who spoke little, yet commanded attention when she did. But now, her voice had no place in the palace. The emperor no longer sought her counsel. His devotion belonged to the priestess and to the cult that had devoured his reason. From her secluded quarters, the queen watched the empire rot beneath the weight of desire. Servants avoided her gaze, afraid of being seen as loyal to the forgotten empress. Each night, she heard the faint echoes from the House of Silk, the muffled chants, the trembling music, the cries that followed. What once had been a home of power was now a temple of degradation. Humiliation was her constant companion. The emperor paraded the priestess at his side, calling her the embodiment of divine pleasure. The queen, stripped of titles, endured in the shadows, a living reminder of what had been discarded. Yet her silence hid a plan, one born not of passion, but of calculation. The famine had shaken the court, and whispers of rebellion spread among the lower servants, the eunuchs who managed the emperor's private chambers, the maids who cleaned the floors after each ritual, the guards who could no longer bear the scent of blood and perfume. These were people invisible to power, but not to the queen. She saw their eyes, hollow yet burning with quiet hatred. She began to speak to them, gently, carefully. She offered no promises of freedom, only purpose. "You have all suffered unseen," she told them, "but I see you. Let us make them see." Her words spread like a secret prayer. One by one, those who had endured without voice came to her side. In the dimness of her chambers, plans were whispered over melted candle wax. The queen knew the cult could not be destroyed by rebellion alone. It thrived on spectacle, on the illusion of sanctity. To end it, she would have to use its own rituals against itself. "Their faith is performance," she said, "and so shall be their fall." Her first move was to infiltrate the ceremonies. Through the eunuchs, she learned of the timing of each gathering, the placement of guards, and the secret symbols of the priestess's followers. The chambermaids smuggled her tokens of the rituals, masks, scripts, even strands of silk drenched in scented oil. The queen studied them as one studies an enemy's scripture. She instructed her allies to remain patient. "Vengeance," she whispered, "must be dressed as devotion." The priestess's arrogance worked in their favor. Convinced of her supremacy, she never suspected that the silent queen was weaving rebellion from within her own court. When the emperor announced another grand ritual, one meant to celebrate the survival of the cult through famine, the queen made her move. Through her loyal servants, she ensured the torches would burn brighter, the perfumes would be heavier, the silks more flammable. No one questioned the additions. The preparations appeared as an act of reverence. The night before the ceremony, the queen stood before her mirror, dressed in mourning black. She removed every jewel from her body and whispered, "If pain is divine, then let the gods watch what I will do." Her reflection did not tremble. The next evening, as the first chants rose and the torches were lit, her eyes met those of the priestess across the hall, two women bound by power, betrayal, and the knowledge that only one of them would leave the House of Silk alive. The night of the ritual arrived like a storm disguised as calm. The palace glowed with the light of 1,000 torches, their flames licking the gold-veined walls. Perfumed smoke drifted through the corridors, thick enough to taste. Servants moved in silence, faces painted white, hands trembling as they prepared the offerings. None dared to meet the emperor's gaze. The emperor stood at the entrance of the House of Silk, robed in crimson. The priestess, radiant beside him, wore a veil woven from silver thread. The queen was absent, or so it seemed. Her chambers were said to be sealed for prayer. In truth, her presence was already inside the house, hidden among those who had come to serve. Inside, the cult gathered. Nobles, priests, and dancers took their places beneath the mirrored dome. The marble floor was slick with oils, ready for the spectacle that would follow. The emperor raised his cup, his voice echoing across the chamber. "Tonight," he declared, we celebrate the divinity of flesh. Tonight we prove that hunger, pain, and desire are one." The crowd responded with a cry, part devotion, part madness. From the shadows, the queen's allies moved as they had been instructed. The chambermaids poured the perfumes thicker, the eunuchs replaced water with oil in the lamps, and the guards at the exits were quietly relieved by others loyal to her cause. Every gesture was part of the ritual, unnoticed yet deliberate. As the chants began, the priestess stepped into the center of the hall. Her body shimmered under the torchlight, her voice commanding as she invoked the sacred hymn of the cult. The emperor watched her with awe, his eyes reflecting the fevered glow. Around them, dancers swayed in unison, bodies painted gold, limbs trembling. Then, a spark. No one saw who dropped the first torch. It might have been a servant's hand or fate itself. The silk curtains caught instantly, burning in streaks of red and orange. At first, the crowd mistook it for part of the ceremony, a divine fire meant to sanctify their devotion. They clapped, they cheered. Only when the flames began to crawl across the floor did the cheering turn to screams. The priestess turned, her veil igniting like dry leaves. Yet she did not run. Her voice rose above the chaos, echoing through the inferno. "Pain is eternal. You cannot burn devotion," she cried, her silhouette framed by fire. The emperor, frozen in disbelief, did not move to save her. The queen stood near the doorway, her face calm as the world she loathed turned to ash. She whispered a single prayer, not to gods, but to those who had died nameless beneath the cult's rituals. Then she gave the signal. The doors, reinforced with iron, slammed shut. Those inside pounded and clawed, but the flames moved faster than breath. The silk walls melted, dripping molten fabric onto bodies that writhed and fell. The music turned to screams. The priestess's voice broke into silence as the roof collapsed. Outside, the emperor watched from his balcony. The fire painted his face in shifting shades of gold and red. The queen stood beside him for a moment, her expression unreadable. When the roof of the house gave way completely, she turned and walked away, her steps echoing through the burning wind. By dawn, the house of silk was gone. Nothing remained but charred stone and the scent of burned perfume that lingered for days. The emperor ordered no mourning. The queen spoke no word of triumph. But the servants whispered, that night, the gods of pleasure had been consumed by their own fire. The fire had ended the cult, but it had not ended its whispers. The ruins of the House of Silk still smoked when the arrests began. Soldiers dragged survivors from cellars, gardens, and secret chambers beneath the palace. Many had been burned beyond recognition, their faces painted with soot and terror. Others knelt silently, refusing to speak even as the chains closed around their wrists. The emperor ordered the trials to begin at dawn. He called them purifications, not punishments. The court was assembled in the Hall of Echoes, a chamber built for music, now filled with trembling confessions. The marble walls still smelled faintly of incense, as though mocking what the empire had become. One by one, the accused were brought forward. Some were nobles who had once ruled provinces. Others were slaves whose only crime was obedience. The priestess was gone, her body never found, and her absence haunted every word spoken. The first witness, a dancer from the house, claimed that she had seen the gods descend during the final ritual, that the fire was a divine response, not rebellion. Her eyes were wild, her voice trembling with devotion. "The flames did not burn us," she whispered. "They embraced us." Another, a guard, confessed between sobs that he had killed his own brother to please the priestess. "She said pain was the only truth," he muttered. "When I felt his blood on my hands, I believed her." The emperor listened in silence. He asked no questions. His face was a mask of calm, but those close enough to see him swore that his hands trembled beneath the table. The queen sat beside him, veiled, her presence as cold as the marble floor. When the chronicler was summoned, the hall fell silent. His scrolls had survived the fire, though much of them were blackened and torn. He stood before the emperor with ink-stained fingers, his eyes hollow. "You were meant to record our triumphs," the emperor said. "Instead, you recorded our shame." The chronicler bowed. "Majesty," he replied, "truth cannot be burned. It hides in the ashes." The emperor's voice hardened. "Then I will turn the ashes to dust." He ordered the chronicler's writings gathered and burned in the courtyard. Scrolls that once glittered with golden ink curled and blackened under the torch. The smoke carried the last memories of the house into the night sky. Yet even as they vanished, fragments were stolen by servants, monks, and scholars who believed that erasing horror only made it return. Outside the palace, rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the priestess's spirit had been seen near the riverbanks, her eyes glowing from beneath the water. Others claimed that the emperor spoke to shadows in his sleep. The queen forbade all mention of the cult, but its name persisted in whispers. The Faith of Silk. Months passed. The trials ended not with verdicts, but with silence. Those found guilty were not executed. They were forgotten, their names struck from every record, their homes dismantled, their families erased. The empire began to rewrite itself, word by word. Pain was renamed devotion. Madness became divine vision. And yet, in the far monasteries of the East, hidden beneath centuries of dust, a few fragments survived, scraps of parchment bearing the chronicler's final marks. In uneven ink, one line appeared again and again. "Those who worship the flesh will be devoured by it." The empire tried to forget, but memory clung like smoke. Years drifted like fading incense. The empire endured, but hollowed. Its borders shrank, its armies lost heart, and its people spoke of omens, of rivers turning black, of statues weeping under the moon. The emperor aged within walls that once trembled with music and sin. The queen had long since died, her body entombed in quiet dignity, while her husband lived on, a ghost surrounded by servants who dared not speak his name above a whisper. She instructed her allies to remain patient. "Vengeance," she whispered, "must be dressed as devotion." The priestess's arrogance worked in their favor. Convinced of her supremacy, she never suspected that the silent queen was weaving rebellion from within her own court. When the emperor announced another grand ritual, one meant to celebrate the survival of the cult through famine, the queen made her move. Through her loyal servants, she ensured the torches would burn brighter, the perfumes would be heavier, the silks more flammable. No one questioned the additions. The preparations appeared as an act of reverence. The night before the ceremony, the queen stood before her mirror, dressed in mourning black. She removed every jewel from her body and whispered, "If pain is divine, then let the gods watch what I will do." Her reflection did not tremble. The next evening, as the first chants rose and the torches were lit, her eyes met those of the priestess across the hall, two women bound by power, betrayal, and the knowledge that only one of them would leave the House of Silk alive. The night of the ritual arrived like a storm disguised as calm. The palace glowed with the light of 1,000 torches, their flames licking the gold-veined walls. Perfumed smoke drifted through the corridors, thick enough to taste. Servants moved in silence, faces painted white, hands trembling as they prepared the offerings. None dared to meet the emperor's gaze. The emperor stood at the entrance of the House of Silk, robed in crimson. The priestess, radiant beside him, wore a veil woven from silver thread. The queen was absent, or so it seemed. Her chambers were said to be sealed for prayer. In truth, her presence was already inside the house, hidden among those who had come to serve. Inside, the cult gathered. Nobles, priests, and dancers took their places beneath the mirrored dome. The marble floor was slick with oils, ready for the spectacle that would follow. The emperor raised his cup, his voice echoing across the chamber. "Tonight," he declared, "we celebrate the divinity of flesh. Tonight, we prove that hunger, pain, and desire are one. The crowd responded with a cry, part devotion, part madness. From the shadows, the queen's allies moved as they had been instructed. The chambermaids poured the perfumes thicker, the eunuchs replaced water with oil in the lamps, and the guards at the exits were quietly relieved by others loyal to her cause. Every gesture was part of the ritual, unnoticed yet deliberate. As the chants began, the priestess stepped into the center of the hall. Her body shimmered under the torchlight, her voice commanding as she invoked the sacred hymn of the cult. The emperor watched her with awe, his eyes reflecting the fevered glow. Around them, dancers swayed in unison, bodies painted gold, limbs trembling. Then, a spark. No one saw who dropped the first torch. It might have been a servant's hand or fate itself. The silk curtains caught instantly, burning in streaks of red and orange. At first, the crowd mistook it for part of the ceremony, a divine fire meant to sanctify their devotion. They clapped, they cheered. Only when the flames began to crawl across the floor did the cheering turn to screams. The priestess turned, her veil igniting like dry leaves. Yet she did not run. Her voice rose above the chaos, echoing through the inferno. Pain is eternal. You cannot burn devotion. She cried, her silhouette framed by fire. The emperor, frozen in disbelief, did not move to save her. The queen stood near the doorway, her face calm as the world she loathed turned to ash. She whispered a single prayer, not to gods, but to those who had died nameless beneath the cult's rituals. Then she gave the signal. The doors, reinforced with iron, slammed shut. Those inside pounded and clawed, but the flames moved faster than breath. The silk walls melted, dripping molten fabric onto bodies that writhed and fell. The music turned to screams. The priestess's voice broke into silence as the roof collapsed. Outside, the emperor watched from his balcony. The fire painted his face in shifting shades of gold and red. The queen stood beside him for a moment, her expression unreadable. When the roof of the house gave way completely, she turned and walked away, her steps echoing through the burning wind. By dawn, the house of silk was gone. Nothing remained but charred stone and the scent of burned perfume that lingered for days. The emperor ordered no mourning. The queen spoke no word of triumph. But the servants whispered, that night, the gods of pleasure had been consumed by their own fire. The fire had ended the cult, but it had not ended its whispers. The ruins of the House of Silk still smoked when the arrests began. Soldiers dragged survivors from cellars, gardens, and secret chambers beneath the palace. Many had been burned beyond recognition, their faces painted with soot and terror. Others knelt silently, refusing to speak even as the chains closed around their wrists. The House of Silk was gone, reduced to stone fragments and ash buried under creeping vines. The emperor forbade its reconstruction, yet every night he wandered the empty corridors of his palace, tracing his fingers over marble as if searching for the pulse of something long extinguished. In his chambers hung portraits of those who once attended him, generals, poets, dancers, all of them dead or disappeared. He would speak to them in the dark, asking questions that no one answered. On the final night of his reign, a storm gathered beyond the capital. Winds rattled the bronze gates and the palace lamps flickered as if afraid to remain awake. The emperor dismissed his attendants and ordered all lights extinguished. The corridors filled with silence so deep it felt alive. Only the faint echo of rain against stone accompanied his steps. He sat in the Hall of Echoes, the same place where the trials had taken place years before. The throne stood empty, the banners faded to gray. Before him rested a single cup of wine, untouched. His reflection trembled in its surface like a ghost reluctant to appear. Memories returned without mercy. The laughter of the priestess, the scent of burning silk, the roar of the crowd as the flames devoured what they once adored. He remembered the queen's eyes, steady and cold, as she sealed his fate with silence. He had conquered kingdoms, commanded armies, bent the will of thousands, yet in the end, it was his own desires that ruled him. A gust of wind forced open a window, scattering dust and remnants of charred paper. Among them drifted a fragment of parchment, no larger than a hand. The emperor recognized the handwriting instantly, the chronicler's. It bore only one line: "Pleasure has no gods, only ghosts." He smiled faintly, though his eyes filled with tears. Perhaps that was the truth he had sought all along. Perhaps every ritual, every cruelty, every cry from the House of Silk had been nothing more than a desperate prayer to a god that never listened. He raised the cup but did not drink. Instead, he placed it before the vacant throne beside him, the seat that once belonged to the queen. "For you," he whispered, though no one remained to hear. When dawn came, the servants found him still seated, his hands folded neatly upon his knees. His face bore a strange peace, as though he had at last surrendered to the silence he once feared. The cup of wine was untouched. A thin line of dust had gathered around its rim. The chronicler's remaining notes end here. The emperor's tomb bears no inscription, only a carved relief of silk threads turning into flames. The empire continued under new rulers, but its heart had already turned to stone. And somewhere, beneath forgotten ruins, fragments of ivory masks still lie buried in the earth, smiling, waiting. For in every age that followed, new rulers would build their own houses of silk, believing themselves immune to the same hunger. Yet the lesson lingered, unspoken and eternal. Those who seek pleasure as power will find both devour them in the end.